You're listening to Aging Today, the podcast where together we explore the options to aging on your terms.
When I get older, losing my hair, many years from now, will you still be sending me a Valentine? Birthday greetings, bottle of wine. If I've been out till 2:45, would you lock the door? Will you still need me? Will you still feed me when I'm 64?
And now the podcast where together we discuss proactive aging on your terms, connecting to the professional advice of our special guests while creating better days throughout the aging process. Now here's your host, Mark Turnbull.
And welcome to Aging Today. We are the podcast where together we do explore the many options to aging on your terms. You can find Aging Today and our 4 years of past programs on our website. All you need to do is go to www.agingtoday.us and you can pick up any of the past programs as well as this one. Then we also another way to find our past shows is you can go to your favorite podcast channel, such as Spotify, Pandora, Apple Podcasts. We're on all of them, iHeart, Streaker, and many others. And you can pick up any of the shows there as well. And then finally, I would like to hear from all of you, our listeners. We've had great conversations with many of you in the past, and we are always interested in hearing more about what your questions are in the aging process, and we always want to make sure that we address those questions with special guests. So if you have a special guest that you would like to introduce to Aging Today, feel free to reach out to me. The best way to do that is email me, your host, Mark Turnbull, and essentially what you do is just type in mark@agingtoday.us. That is Mark with a K, mark@agingtoday.us, and I'd love to hear from you and get any of your questions answered or introduce us to any of your special guests that you would like to hear from. Well, as you know, this show is about the aging process, and it is about aging on your terms. And sometimes your terms didn't include having a caregiver, a complete stranger coming into your home, or whether it's a complete stranger, maybe it was a family member that you would have never had thought about, and having your daughter, your son be your primary caregiver, and that's where you find yourself. And our guest today addresses that. He's been at all of those levels of being a caregiver, and his name is Dr. Aaron Blight. Dr. Blight, welcome to Aging Today.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm very excited to hear about you and your work and what you're doing. And you started out as a caregiver a long time ago, and then we're anxious to hear your story, how you have evolved and how you're helping family caregivers around the world. So give us a little bit of background of where you came from and how you got to this place of being the founder of Caregiving Kinetics and also being an international speaker and as well as a family caregiver.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. And I really appreciate the opportunity to join you today. Thank you. I would say that my caregiving experience really began over 20 years ago when I was working at the National Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. I was a federal healthcare bureaucrat, and I was young. I was 29 years old. I had a few kids, and we had a growing family. And I actually worked in the Disabled and Elderly Health Programs group of the federal Medicaid program. And if I'm being honest with you, Mark, I really didn't understand a whole lot about what it meant to be elderly or disabled at that time in my life. But we lived near my mother-in-law, and one day we were over at her home for a barbecue, and she told us that she was seeing flashing lights. And she said, these just kind of appeared out of nowhere, and she was going to the doctor that week to get that checked out. Well, that visit to the doctor resulted in a cancer diagnosis. They told her that she was only 59 years old, but they told her that she had a brain tumor the size of a golf ball, and that it needed to be surgically removed immediately. If not, she had maybe weeks to live. And they said if she had the brain surgery and she survived the OR, that maybe she would live 6 to 9 months. And so she chose to have the brain surgery. She had very cutting-edge, innovative brain surgery at Johns Hopkins University in Maryland. And she needed a place to recover for a couple of weeks after her brain surgery. So the extent of our thought process was, well, Mom needs a place to recover. She needs help. We'll just invite her into our home. So she moved into our home, and she was going to stay for about 2 weeks to recover from her brain surgery. She ended up living with us for almost 2 years. She lived for a total of 5.5 years after that diagnosis, which was a miracle. But she was in a steady state of cognitive decline. And when she lived in our home, she also went through radiation, chemotherapy. The brain tumor was the result of lung cancer that had metastasized to the brain. And she had a second brain surgery also while she was in our home. And so we became family caregivers basically overnight. We were the kind of sandwich generation style. And once the caregiving started, the family caregiving started, it did not end until she ultimately passed away 5.5 years later. And so shortly after that, was really about a year after that, I was in a different role in the federal Medicaid program. But things were different. My mother-in-law was now deceased, and my wife said, "You've always wanted to start your own business. Maybe now's the time to do that." And so my mind immediately went to home care, because the last couple of months of my mother-in-law's life, when she was a hospice patient and the cancer had returned with a vengeance, she received home care services. And that company was a godsend for us. And so I thought, well, I'd like to help families like mine and provide that type of support to families in need. And so that led me to opening my own home care business. And we relocated to the Winchester, Virginia area, and my home care company grew and grew, and we provided help to thousands of families over the years. And so in a nutshell, I ended up going back to school. I got a doctoral degree and studied caregiving as a phenomenon of social science, and then sold my home care company, which led me to open Caregiving Kinetics. And now I talk with care organizations and caregivers all over the world about the care experience. And I wrote a book, When Caregiving Calls, Guidance as You Care for a Parent, Spouse, or Aging Relative, about a year ago. So that's kind of what led me to where I am today, Mark.
Yeah, it's quite an extensive background, and it was a progression.
Yes, it was.
And just one thing, right after the other, was just the consequences of one experience led to another experience. What was it? Tell us a little bit about the experience that you had getting your doctorate in caregiving, moving from, owning a company and working with caregivers on a regular day-to-day basis, and then making that adjustment. That had to have been a huge, psychological, mental adjustment.
It was. My doctorate is actually, I'm a doctor of education. My doctorate is in learning. It is technically in human and organizational learning. And so it's all about how we as human beings, but particularly as adults, how we understand the world around us, how we learn and develop as adults, how we relate to one another, and how we establish our own kind of culture. And so when I was decided to go back to school to get my doctoral degree, it was really, for me, I just wanted to learn. I love to learn. And for my dissertation, I wanted to study something that was actually very relevant to my business. And so I chose to study caregiving, and I have examined caregiving as a transformative learning experience, because that's what it is. Mm-hmm. Caregiving transforms your life when you're in it, and it helps you to shape your sense of who you are and where you fit in the world, and it affects your relationships. And so I examined caregiving through the lens of adult learning, social psychology.
So,
Mark, you probably, I know you're in the field, and I know that you understand this. When we talk about caregiving, there is so much focus on the tasks of caregiving, mm-hmm. and rightfully so, because there's always this to-do list. But and so it's very important to really meet the demands of the tasks of caregiving that your loved one has. But when you really get underneath the tasks of caregiving and you examine the dynamics, the social dynamics of caregiving, the relationship dynamics of caregiving, you start to see what's happening to you and to your loved one, and that can make a profound difference in the care experience.
Yeah. Can you give us an example of what, because I'm in 100% agreement with you. Carrying out the task, or having the training of caregivers, and whether it's professional caregivers or family caregivers, there's two aspects to being a caregiver. It's having those skills, which you can teach a monkey how to do, that I always say, and I get a chuckle out of my caregivers. But at the same time, really where the greatest impact that a caregiver can have is on the relational, and how to communicate, how to relate to, and I love what your doctorate was how to relate to adults. And essentially that's what we're doing, is how do you do that? And especially what I want you to address is the generational gaps between oftentimes caregivers, whether they're family or professional caregivers, that they have with the one that they're taking care of, because they grew up in a totally different generation of culture.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Mark. There's so much underneath all of that, what you touched on. And you talk about kind of the generational gaps. Let's just use the example of a family, and let's say it's a parent who is now in need of support and caregiving assistance, and their adult child, let's just say it's a daughter, has stepped in to fill that role. So right there you have a generational difference, right? And even more significantly, you have a historic family relationship that has been established since the birth of that daughter, right? That, let's say it's a mother and a daughter. So that person has always been your mother. And so the mother-daughter relationship is a singular relationship in life, right? When you think about what it means to be a mother, your mother cared for you, and she gave you life, and she fed you, and she clothed you, and she wiped away your tears, and she encouraged you, and or maybe she wasn't very nice to you sometimes, I don't know. But as a daughter, that's always how you've envisioned her, and your relationship with her is embedded in that historic context. Your relationship with your mother is different than every other relationship that you've had with any other human being in your life. And so the way that you interact with your mother has always been defined by those two roles, mother, daughter. And so when caregiving enters the picture here now, things will be different. The mother who raised you, the mother who was always independent, who taught you and provided all of those things for you, now suddenly that same individual is dependent upon care by you. And so the nature of your interactions with your mother will change. The things that you say to your mother will be different. The things that you think about when it comes to your mother will be different. And so what's happened here is a change of roles. And in social psychology, roles are a big deal. If you think about some of the roles that you occupy in life, for example, Mark, you're interviewing me today, right? You're a podcaster. That's a role, and you're an interviewer, and that's a role, and I'm the interviewee. And those are and you own a home care company, and so those are roles that you have opted into, that you have chosen. Well, nobody really chooses the role of care receiver. Nobody chooses to be a patient. That role it just happens. It emerges because of a health condition. So your mother now, who's always been your mother in that relationship, now suddenly she has this new role of care recipient. And there is no caregiver. There is no role of caregiver without a care receiver. Mm-hmm. So because of the needs of the care receiver, this new role of caregiver enters into the relationship. And so now it's not just about mother-daughter. It's also about care receiver and caregiver. And those roles will start to mark your interactions between the two individuals. And so that historic context, that historic relationship will always come to bear on what's happening today. But what's happening today is markedly different than what happened in the past. So it really requires significant adjustments by both the mother and the daughter. And it can be very disconcerting and very troubling and distressing. And so the way that you advance through that change in the relationship can have a big impact on your mental health and on your present and future relationship with your loved one.
Talk a little bit about the care receiver in that generation. And when I'm talking about that generation, my mom and dad's generation, they're 91. They're still in their home. And they're the part of that world's greatest generation. And I truly, truly believe that. But my goodness, they're the most stubborn generation I've ever seen. And how do you get them to that place where they will acknowledge that they need care? They need to start receiving the care, whether it's from a caregiver from their own family or friends or from a professional caregiver.
Yeah. Well, you're right, Mark. Oftentimes, elderly adults, they've lived independently. They have provided for themselves. People who are in that age bracket, and I know that we're generalizing, but they tend to be very independent, and they've survived wars and a lot of conflict
and pandemics.
And pandemics.
Yeah. And, we think today that we're the unique in surviving pandemics, and no, that's not true.
Yeah. They're children often of the Great Depression, so they're very thrifty and frugal, and so they may be very reluctant to spend money on things like caregiving services. And in addition to that, they've always been the parent in the relationship. And so another part of that is many people in this age bracket are perhaps less inclined to say, I want help or I need help from my adult children. And so how do you kind of crack the nut there and engage in a productive conversation about receiving help? I think there are a couple of things that can contribute to that, Mark. The first thing, when you have someone who's fiercely independent and they don't really want help at all, this is unfortunate, but sometimes what it takes is an event, and something happens that causes the elderly person to realize they're vulnerable, they are not safe in their current living arrangements, and they become a little bit frightened. Maybe it's a fall, and they fall down and they can't get up, and there's nobody there to help them, and they sit on the floor for hours, or they break a hip, or they get a diagnosis that is now a death sentence. But that can lead to a sobering realization that, okay, it's time for me to reach out for help, and I need to do that. Sometimes it can be the pleading of an adult child, and the realization that, well, my kid really is looking out for me and wants to help me, and you may be able to get through to the person and help them have the foresight to realize, yeah, I'm gonna need some additional help. And so planning for an event could be really helpful. A third way, I think, that especially in the U.S., Mark, that can be really beneficial is a discussion with the elderly person's doctor. A lot of times older people are more inclined to listen to their doctor than their adult child. And so if the doctor can be brought into the conversation and the doctor can convey the health conditions that are a concern and can strongly suggest the need for additional supports at home, the elderly person might be more inclined to listen.
Yeah, I think that's well said. Sometimes it's the impetus to admitting that you need some help is when you actually go through an experience, and sometimes for the children, the adult children of mom and dad, they get a little impatient and they say, well, we need to take care of this now. We need to start preparing and planning, and sometimes that generation just is in denial, and you got to wait for that moment when they start to lose some of their independence, and that will be the impetus to begin to have the conversation.
Yeah. It's kind of a balancing act, isn't it, with when you're an adult child, because you always want to respect your parents' independence and grant them the independence that they deserve as human beings. And so, I had experiences like this. I think I shared one in my book, When Caregiving Calls, where, very well-intentioned adult children want to come in and really get overly involved in the lives of their elderly parents to the point that they're controlling them. And, you don't want to take it that far, where you start to control them and they lose the ability to direct their own lives and their own affairs. I think that's an important part of being a caregiver. If you're an adult child, is always encouraging as much independence as possible for your parent.
Yeah. Do you have, Dr. Blight, do you have a working definition of what is a caregiver?
I do, and I don't know that I could give it to you verbatim from When Caregiving Calls, Mark, but it is providing active services and supports to another individual who, for reasons associated with age or disability or another health condition, cannot provide for themselves in terms of their activities of daily living. I've also seen it applied in a parental context. I've seen it used where parents are caregivers for their children. It also is used in a professional context where doctors and nurses and occupational therapists and physical therapists, they're all caregivers as well. They're licensed healthcare professionals, and the licensing professional part of it introduces a whole different aspect of caregiving. But the way that I talk about it in When Caregiving Calls, and the way that we discuss it in home care, is really help with activities of daily living.
And let's take a dive into your book, if we may. It's called When Caregiving Calls, and I think it's a very well written book, and there's about 18 chapters there that you've broken down into. And the thing I appreciated about your book is that they weren't overly written. I mean, they weren't long chapters. It was nice to be able to just get to the heart of the matter in the different chapter titles, and then move on to the next one. And I really appreciated that. Sometimes scholarly people can drag on and on and on.
Yes, that was a very intentional effort on my part, Mark. I did not want to write one of those books that just goes on and on and on. I wanted it to be concise and accessible for the everyday person who is in this family caregiving situation.
Yeah.
So thank you. That's really means a lot to hear that feedback.
And not only that, I like the way I want you to talk a little bit about the book and how you formulated the book. You ended each chapter with questions, and kind of go into what you were trying to do there, because I thought it was very effective to the reader.
Thank you. Yeah. So when I was writing When Caregiving Calls, I was, again, just my background, having been in national healthcare policy, having studied caregiving, having had a professional caregiving business, having been a family caregiver, I kept really thinking about just the everyday family caregiver, and I kept asking myself, what are their challenges? What do they need to know? Not about the tasks of caregiving, because this is not a book about the tasks of caregiving. It's about what's the social and relationship dynamics of caregiving and the emotional challenges of caregiving. And so I kept asking myself, what do the caregivers need to understand and know? And so I wrote the chapters based on that. And so there are chapters there, and each chapter is just a single word. There's one on family, there's one on relationship, there's one on roles, stress, emotion, independence, home. There's a chapter on faith. But so, I spent a lot of time writing it, and then I thought, well, these are great informational chapters, but I wanted to create a book that would maybe do a little bit more than just inform caregivers, but could actually potentially transform their caregiving experience. And this is where my doctoral degree in learning comes into play. We know that through intentional reflection and written reflection, that you can learn. By thinking deeply about your experiences, that is a gateway to better understanding. And so at the end of each chapter, I decided to incorporate questions for reflection, which are designed to prompt the caregiver to think about what they just read and apply it to their own personal situation. And if the caregiver does that, they're going to gain insights about their caregiving experience that they never had before. And at the end of the book, if the person has gone through that active reflection process, writing and reflecting, they're invited to prioritize, to go back and review everything that they've reflected upon and kind of prioritize their next steps so that they can improve their caregiving experience for themselves and their loved one. And I've actually had some very heartwarming, humbling, amazing feedback about the questions for reflection, Mark. And so I know that the caregivers that have done this have really gotten a lot out of the exercise.
Yeah, I know I did, because I could relate to a lot of those questions, as I've been a caregiver myself, and then also leading other caregivers in these particular topics that you list in the chapter. Was there any one chapter title that you resonated? I'm sure you wouldn't have written them at all if you didn't resonate, but is there one in particular that really stands out to you?
Yes.
That was your favorite one to write about?
Well, my favorite one to kind of talk about is the relationship chapter. And that's really because of my own experience as a family caregiver, Mark. I told you earlier that family caregiving was just thrust upon me. I was totally unprepared for it. I was not in any way thinking that I would have caregiving responsibility for my mother-in-law at such a young age. And on the one hand, I wanted to be there and help her, but I had no understanding of what that was going to do to our family, to our home, to my wife. And the longer that she lived with us, the more resentful I became of her presence there in our home. And I had this kind of internal conflict within myself, because I wanted to help her and I wanted her to be there. I knew that she needed the support that we were giving her. And she was a great mother-in-law. I loved her. She treated me like a son from the moment that I started dating her daughter. But on the other hand, even though I wanted her there, I resented the fact that she was there. And I got to where I started using language like my nuclear family, and how I longed to just have my nuclear family back with just my wife and children and me, and not my mother-in-law, because she was just a constant presence in our home, and the looming specter of cancer and terminal illness.
Now, did you have children home at the time when that
we did?
You were caring? We had. Then that's got to be an interesting dynamic as well. On top of, usually it's just one, it's just two people that are in. You're just the kids. You're empty nesters, and that's about the time you take on the role of being a caregiver for mom and dad. But not in your case. I mean, you still had children at home.
Yeah, we did. My wife became pregnant, and we had our fourth child while her mother lived with us. But even for empty nesters, I have seen this in my community with people that we serve. They have the same kind of internal conflict about what's happening to their lives, and so we went through that 5.5 years of caregiving for my mother-in-law, and I, through my home care company, helped other families facing the same challenges. And later, when I was doing my literature review for my doctoral degree and my dissertation, I came across family caregiver identity theory, which is in applied gerontology, and it was developed by two scholars, Rhonda Montgomery and Carl Kozlowski. And it views family caregiving as a series of role-based transitions that are precipitated by the changing health conditions of the care receiver. And we talked a little bit about that earlier, Mark. And so in when Caregiving Calls, I try to I describe family caregiver identity theory. And when I first was reading it and learning about it, I was utterly blown away by it because it was so on point and accurate and descriptive of exactly why I was having such a hard time with my mother-in-law. Of course, this was now years after she had passed away, and I was now discovering the very essence of my challenge. And and family caregiver identity theory also indicates that, if there's a disconnect between what you're doing in this relationship with your loved one and what you think you should be doing in your relationship with your loved one, it's an identity conflict, and you need to resolve that. And so for me, I just wanted to be the son-in-law. I didn't want to be a caregiver for my mother-in-law. And the longer that went on, the harder it was for me to accept. I never fully transitioned mentally and in my relationship with my mother-in-law to that, even though I was doing it. And she didn't choose to have cancer. That wasn't the ideal situation for her. But I was, kind of kicking and scratching the whole way. And so when Caregiving Calls, in the relationship chapter, we talk about how these roles evolve and change and what you as a family caregiver can do to adapt. And as you adapt to these changing roles, you're going to be a better caregiver and you're going to be a happier person.
You're listening to Aging Today with your host, Mark Turnbull, and his guest, Dr. Aaron Blight, author of When Caregiving Calls, Guidance as you care for a parent, spouse, or aging relative. We'll hear more of this conversation in just a moment.
Sometimes I'd like to smack old age right in the kisser. Ow.
Oh yeah, still got those moves.
I will be fabulous.
Comfort Care can help with as much or as little home care as you need. From medication reminders and meal prep to everyday chores and errands. Let us create your personalized care plan and find the perfect caregiver match so you can live your best life possible.
Call Comfort Care at 503-636-0417.
A Did You Know moment from Comfort Care Home Care of West Lynn.
Did you know that there are more than 53 million family caregivers in America? That's about 21% of the adult population in the United States, and those numbers are growing. People are often surprised when they hear the vast numbers that quantify how pervasive caregiving is in our society. At the same time, caregiving is an intensely personal experience. If you are involved in caregiving, the chances are exceptionally high that your life will be changed by the experience. Dr. Aaron Blight wrote the award-winning book, When Caregiving Calls, Guidance as you care for a parent, spouse, or aging relative, to help families who are struggling with their own caregiving situations. His book can be found online and at brick-and-mortar bookstores. This Did You Know moment is brought to you by Comfort Care Home Care of West Lynn, Oregon. Call today at 503-636-0417.
Now, more of our discussion with host Mark Turnbull and his guest, Dr. Aaron Blight, author of When Caregiving Calls on Aging Today.
Do you find that there are certain characteristics or behavioral attributes that some people have that make them better caregivers than others? Because I always say all of us are caregivers. At some point, we're caring for, people all the time. But to be a caregiver day after day after day takes a very special person. And especially when you're, caring for somebody beyond just the psychological and the spiritual, but you're really getting into now, having to get your hands dirty, so to speak. And you've got ADL care and the personal care that is involved with all of that. That's a whole nother level. Do you find that there are certain characteristics that make people better caregivers than others?
Yes, I think that there are a few things that I would say to that, Mark. One is just compassion and empathy. Another thing is really just being hardwired with a service orientation. Some people are more service oriented than others. When it comes to caring for a family member, I think it's really loyalty. You mentioned something about, the hands-on personal care assistance, and this is also something that I got into in my doctoral dissertation, which is what I call the dirty work of caregiving. And it's hands-on assistance with things like toileting, bathing, grooming, and where you are physically touching another person's body and in particular private parts and things like that. And in sociology, there is a whole stream of literature on dirty work. And dirty work is tasks and functions that could be disgusting to other people. Other people might say, when they hear that you do that, they might say, "Oh, wow, I could never do that. That's gross." It's work that is either physically or morally or socially tainted.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of stigmatizing. So that could be something like a bail bondsman or a janitor. In fact, there was a seminal study of hospital janitors, and what the researchers found is that the workers, people who are involved in dirty work, they don't look upon the tasks of their work as gross or stigmatizing. They actually reframe the stigmatizing nature of the jobs to create a positive sense of identity. And so these janitors in this study who are working at a hospital, you think about in a hospital, you've got all kinds of doctors and nurses, and they're medical professionals, and they're running around with their busy schedules. And then you've got the janitors who are cleaning up the poop and the vomit and mopping the floors. And well, the janitors themselves, they didn't look at themselves as being the lowest in the hierarchy. They actually redefined their roles as being integral to maintaining a hygienic environment and helping the patients to get well by promoting good sanitation and cleanliness. And they viewed themselves as a very important part of that hospital's operations. And so this was an example of a case where people who are doing those kind of yucky jobs actually find positive aspects of it and use it to shape a positive sense of self. And so when it comes to caregiving and the hands-on tasks of caregiving, including toileting assistance and wiping people and things like that, our culture tells us, oh, that's kind of taboo. You really shouldn't be doing that type of thing. Or it's shameful for the care receiver. Somebody who is incontinent, an adult who is incontinent, can feel less than human because of what our culture says about this subject. And so when caregivers can have the empathy to get past the cultural taboos associated with hands-on incontinence care and approach that type of activity in a way that allows the care receiver to retain their dignity and their sense of humanity and their sense of pride and self, that is a great caregiver. And so I've seen this with professional caregivers who worked for my home care company. They come in and, there's a soiled diaper or there's a mess in the bathroom. They just take it in stride. And others might come in and they might say, oh, I want to be friends with Mrs. Jones, but I can't do the toileting. I can't do the hands-on. And with family caregivers, this also can be a factor, especially with adult children. That's often the getting off point for adult children who are caring for their aging parents. When incontinence sets in and the need for hands-on help with toileting and bathing, there are many adult children who say, that's my mom, that's my dad. I just can't do that with them. And so they turn over the care to formal care providers. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just part of that historic relationship context. And, the family caregiver might say, I just can't see my dad naked and help him with that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Spousal caregivers tend to continue on in the caregiving role. They're more likely to not shy away from that type of care, and that's because of the historic spousal relationship, right? Which is, there's been intimacy there, and there's more of a sense of comfort about seeing one another naked.
Mm-hmm. And the prospect of not letting them suffer, there's more of an emotional connection there.
Absolutely.
Sure. Yeah, we've seen quite a bit of, and there are different types of caregivers. I think some caregivers perform and function better with companion care versus personal care. And
right.
And I think that extends not only for professional caregivers, but also family caregivers as well, just as you've described.
That's right. And, one thing, Mark, that I think is important to point out is that there are all kinds of different family caregivers. There are all kinds of different care circumstances and situations and relationships out there. And it's important to realize that, we shouldn't go around judging a family caregiver for what they did or did not do. Family caregivers have all kinds of reasons that they might be able or unable to deliver the care that's required by a loved one. And sometimes I think that they feel guilty, or they feel judged, or they feel like if they can't do what is required of them, they are not a good, spouse or son or daughter or whatever. And that's just not the case. As a care receiver's needs increase and they get to the point that they really need constant attention, it's really extremely difficult for a single individual to meet all of their needs.
Yeah.
And so you have to reach the point where you can say it's okay to bring in others and let others help, because you can't do this alone when the needs become so great that it's just impossible for you to do it.
Yeah, and caregiving oftentimes is not a sprint. It's an endurance race. Can be a long time. It could be 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever it may require of that person. And if you find yourself as a caregiver in that long distance, caregiving relationship, talk a little bit about the need for support groups for caregivers, and not just professional caregivers, but for especially family caregivers. Describe support groups and how those function.
Yeah, support groups are just outstanding resources for family caregivers, and support groups are other family caregivers who get together, and they share something in common with the care experiences. And so it could be a support group that's organized around a specific disease condition. For example, there are Alzheimer's caregiver support groups, or Parkinson's caregiver support groups, or cancer caregiver support groups. Or they could be geographically located, where it's caregivers in the community who are banding together when there are various conditions that are being discussed, or they could be so they could be in person, or they could be online. There are a lot of online communities for family caregivers now, and the idea is that you get together on a routine basis, maybe once a month, and you talk with each other about your struggles, and you celebrate together with your victories, and you share your knowledge, and you share your contacts, and you give each other moral support. And so when people get involved in caregiver support groups, it can be a significant change in your care experience, because you're no longer alone. You have other people that you can learn from, other people that you can lean on, other people that can share the emotional load or just relate to what you're experiencing. And Mark, I'm familiar with a lot of these folks that join caregiver support groups, and they participate through the duration of their loved ones' health challenges all the way up till the person dies. And then even after that, they remain connected to the people that they met and became friends with through these caregiver support groups. Those are the types of ties that can be created through a caregiver support group. And
your book,
really free.
Yeah, and your book, it can be a great support to a support group. Talk a little bit about that and how that would work.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that how I wrote when Caregiving Calls, and had the chapters, and then decided to try to incorporate adult learning theory, and I wrote those questions. And I find that often caregivers themselves have the best answers to their problems, but they just may not know the questions to ask. And so so those questions are in there. And it wasn't until months later that I realized that those questions, the format of the book, is perfectly conducive to caregiver support groups, because a support group that meets once a month, for example, they could simply go through a couple of chapters during the month, and then when they convene, they can go through the questions, and it's all set for you. All you got to do is open up, okay, this month we read the chapter on relationship and the chapter on family, and let's talk about these questions. What's going on in your relationship with your loved one? What's going on with your extended family? And those questions are great springboards into a dialogue among the family caregivers. And the University of Virginia Cancer Center just sort of intuitively saw this, and they started a support group for their caregivers of cancer patients using the book, and they said that it has been very well received, and it's prompted a lot of great discussion. So I was really excited to hear that.
Yeah, and that makes it practical. And I think that's one of the things that I enjoyed so much about your book, is that it has a little bit of scholarship in it, but not too much where it puts me to sleep, and it gets right down to the heart of the matter. And then having those questions, I thought that's brilliant to be able to provide that, because a lot of times I don't even know the questions to ask in many cases. And you provide those, and I thought, wow, what a great start for a support group to be able to have and share, in those questions together. Yeah,
you're exactly right, Mark. As family caregivers, you often don't know the questions to ask. You don't know what you're in for. I go back to my experience as a family caregiver. I just had no clue what I was in for. But then over the course of many years working with families, working in caregiving, studying caregiving, it's become something that, this is sort of my thing, and I just kind of leaned into it and have learned. And so those questions can really help guide and shape the care experience for the family member. And there was an early reader of the book who was a family caregiver, and she said, she mentioned the questions, and she said, well, I liked the questions for reflection, but I didn't like the questions for reflection. And I asked her what she meant, and she said, well, I guess there were some things that I just did not want to think about. But then she paused and she goes, but I know that I had to think about them, so they were good.
Yeah. Insightful. Very good. Very good. So COVID, we got to ask the question about COVID and how that's changed the nature of caregiving.
Yeah. Wow. COVID has had such an impact on caregiving. First of all, just the impact on the caregivers and the care receivers. There was a study that came out from the Rosalind Carter Institute for Caregiving that said some 83% of family caregivers are feeling more stress because of COVID. And why is that? It's because of the risk of transmission of COVID. You have to be vigilant about, you have an elderly, vulnerable loved one with compromised health to begin with, and you have to be super conscientious about, not introducing COVID to them. And so all of the protocols that you have to follow to do that. The other thing is just there's less help. A lot of family caregivers were not able to bring in outside care assistance due to COVID. And so what does that mean? That means that they themselves have to provide more care. Or even if you have a loved one who's in a facility, as you know, Mark, so many facilities close their doors to visitors. And so, there you are with your loved one inside the facility. You can't go see them. And so you worry about, and we know what happened in some of these nursing homes in the early days of COVID. So there's just a total increase in worry and concern and stress for individual family caregivers and their care receivers.
So I think one of the things that, I want all of our listening audience to know is that caregivers are the number one piece to making sure that we all can have that option to remain independent in our own homes till their very end. And we've got to make sure that all of our caregivers are receiving the type of care that they need. I often say that, we're the caregivers to our caregivers, and our caregivers have got to be taken care of because there's so few that I consider to be a real, true caregiver. There's only, I would say, probably less than 1% of any population are the true caregivers in our society. And when you find that caregiver, you got to make sure that we take really good care of them. They need self-care in addition to all the things that are going on with COVID-19, which adds another layer of burden on their shoulders, and on it goes.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that our collective consciousness of caregiving has increased, and our recognition that caregivers need support, as you were kind of saying, has increased. And so I think that's a good thing. I think that caregivers have often been the unsung heroes of our long-term care delivery system, and they're starting to be recognized and supported and helped in new ways because of COVID.
Yeah. I had a guest on our show, Elaine Sanchez. I don't know if you've heard of her. She's does the caregiverhelp.com. and support groups, and I think she's doing a wonderful work. And I was going to say, if you haven't heard of her, boy, now's the time to get on and connect up with her. But as connected as you are, you've done it.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, she's great.
Yeah. Okay. And so now you also are a professor, or you're teaching at Shenandoah University. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So after I completed my doctoral degree, I joined there as an adjunct faculty member, and I teach in the business school, healthcare management, and also in the public health program. I have an aging and public health class, and so I get to do that, and I really enjoy being an adjunct professor.
Yeah,
it's like, to me, it's kind of like being a grandparent. You get to have fun with the kids, and then all that other stuff you don't have to worry about.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting is usually people start in academia and sometimes never go into the practical world. But you started in the practical world. You ran a business.
That's right.
You did the actual caregiving for your mother-in-law, and you've walked through all those stages, and now you get to share all of your wisdom and your knowledge with other people. Yeah,
I do. I really do enjoy the teaching there, and there are some really bright students, and it's very, very rewarding when the light bulb goes off and they start to see things a little bit clearer. You know, when you're young and you're in your 20s, you got your whole life ahead of you, and you're healthy, and you may not have really experienced some of the types of things that we're discussing here today, Mark. But I've had a few students that have come back to me later, and they've said, I had a family member with this health challenge, and thanks to the classes, I was able to understand it better or help my loved one. So that's what makes it worth it for me.
Well, I think that's where you can always go back to your students and say, well, it's true. There's only the two certainties in life. One is death. And so you're all going to face it. We're all going to face it. I haven't seen anybody yet that has been able to escape it. Except for one individual, but the rest of us, we're going to get there. And so you better be kind to your children, because they may be your caregivers someday. And you probably see a lot of that too, don't you? Where there's that parent that was not kind or disconnected from their children, and then all of a sudden they find themselves in need, and then they're coming back to the children, and then there's resentment on the that the children are going through. Well, do I want to do this? And I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that, but that's a real thing.
It is a real thing, and there's a passage in When Caregiving Calls that talks about that exact issue. The passage is on imperfect relationships, relationships that have historically not been good, where perhaps the individual family members are estranged, or they haven't. There's a lot of bad feelings that are there, and sometimes when these caregiving situations emerge, all of that just bubbles up to the surface, and it can create a lot of resentment. It can things that have been buried in the past can come up now to the present, and families need to figure out how to address that. And sometimes the way to address that is to not engage, to just continue as before, or in some cases, there's actually healing that occurs between the people. Mm-hmm. when you're looking at your mortality and you realize your days are numbered, that can change things. And I have personally seen families that have been able to heal in the final days of life. So you never know.
Yeah. Well, and maybe that's a good place for us to end. I know that, and is there anything else that you want to talk about the book, and anything that you want to pass on to the rest of our listening audience about When Caregiving Calls?
Yeah, Mark, thank you for asking. I would just say that I do offer workshops and talks, and I travel all over the country. And so I'm very willing to go out and speak to a group. And I also do those things online since COVID has happened.
Yeah, I was going to say the
virtual events as well.
Yep, doing the virtual thing. Gotcha. Yeah. Okay.
And the other thing, Mark, is I would just like to thank you for having me on the show today. I really have enjoyed speaking with you, and I know that you're an expert on this stuff as well. So I really appreciate your time and your feedback.
Well, we're all growing in the role of a caregiver, and what does that mean, and how to relate to other adults, and I really appreciate you going back to the university and making it your doctorate thesis on how to relate to adults. And because that's what really caregiving is all about. That's what we often say in our in-home care agency, that what life is all about. Life is about relationships. Can't get any more complicated than that. It's very simple. And right. I invite our listening audience to look at life as that simple. It's about relationships. And I always say there's two types of relationships. There's a vertical and a horizontal. The vertical is the relationship with a higher power, whatever that means to you. And then the relationship with our fellow human beings as we traverse this earth. And we're all trying to figure it out, and how to relate to one another is so very, very important.
Amen to that, Mark. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks again, Dr. Blight, for being on Aging Today. And we'd love to have you come back again. So keep that in mind. And let's talk. There's so much more. We just touched the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, I would love to return. Thank you.
All right. Well, if you hang on, then as we conclude here, and I'd like to discuss with you a little bit further. But this is Mark Turnbull, your host. Thank you for tuning in to Aging Today, the podcast where together we explore together the options to aging on your terms. Join us again next week for another lively discussion on Aging Today. And remember, we're all in the process of aging, and as we age, we really are better together. So stay young at heart.
You make me feel so young. You make me feel like spring has sprung. And every time I see your face, I'm such a happy individual. The moment that you speak, I want to go play hide and seek. I want to go and bounce the moon just like a toy balloon. Well, you and I are just like a couple of tots running across the meadow, picking up lots of forget-me-nots. So you made me feel so young. You made me feel there are songs to be sung, bells to be rung, and a wonderful thing to be fun. And even when I'm old and gray.
You've been listening to Aging Today, where together we explore the options to aging on your terms. Join Mark and his guest next week for another lively discussion on proactively aging on your terms, connecting you to the professional advice of his special guests, with the goal of creating better days throughout the aging process. Your host has been Mark Turnbull. Join Mark and his guests every week on Aging Today, your podcast to exploring your options for aging on your terms.
And even when I'm old and gray, you make me feel the way I feel today. 'Cause you make me feel so. You make me feel so. You make me feel so young. So young. You make me feel so young. You make me feel so young.